Our Inspirational Indie Authors podcast stream is proudly sponsored by Book Vault. Sell high-quality print-on-demand books directly to readers worldwide and earn maximum royalties selling directly. Automate fulfillment and create stunning special editions with Book Vault Bespoke. Visit bookvault.app today for an instant quote. I'm Howard Lovey of the Alliance of Independent Authors and book editor at howardlovey.com, and you're listening to Inspirational Indie Authors. Every episode, I interview an ally member to find out what inspires them and how they are an inspiration to other authors. My guest this episode is Patrick D. Joyce, who grew up at U.S. embassies in places like Moscow, Havana, and Managua, surrounded by secret spies and surveillance. He went on to become a journalist, earn a Ph.D. in political science, and eventually found his way to writing Cold War-era young adult thrillers. We talk about how his past shaped his storytelling and how he's connecting with young readers today. I'll let Patrick D. Joyce tell his story.
Hi, my name is Patrick D. Joyce, and I am the author of two young adult mystery thrillers set during the Cold War. The first one, back in the USSR, is about two 14-year-olds who race against spies and mobsters to try to recover a priceless vinyl record that just might save the world. And my second book, Strawberry Fields, is about two young journalists caught in the middle of the invasion of Prague in 1968, who receive a cryptic message concealed inside a song and have to uncover a shadowy conspiracy before the city falls.
That's great. You got music, you've got Cold War, you've got spies, you've even mobsters. So that's quite a combination.
Yes.
So let's start from the beginning. Tell me where you grew up. Was reading and writing always a part of your life?
Yeah, so to take the second part of that first, I can't really remember a time in my life when I wasn't writing something. I started to write poetry in high school, and in college I wrote for the student newspaper. After that, I became a newspaper reporter and was, writing on deadline and really honing my craft as a writer. I switched gears after that and went for my PhD in political science and switched to a completely different kind of writing, which was academic and much different than the very sort of sparse, powerful, concise kind of writing you need as a reporter in journalism. But I wrote academic articles and a nonfiction book. So it wasn't until a long time after that I started writing fiction. And after I became actually a stay-at-home dad and then began to help my wife out with her career as a pediatrician, we started her own solo medical practice.
So you're rushing on ahead. We'll get to that in a
I
minute.
am.
Let's go way back to your childhood again. So I guess you had a kind of unique upbringing. You lived in a lot of different countries. Tell me all the places you lived as a child.
Yes. So now the flashback before the flashback.
Right.
So I grew up in a diplomatic family, Howard, and my father was a U.S. Foreign Service officer. So I spent a lot of time growing up at embassies in foreign capitals, and he was actually a Soviet expert. So we lived 3 times in Moscow during the 1970s and 1980s. And we lived at a bunch of embassies in different countries, but also in some other countries that were allies of the Soviet Union, other communist authoritarian countries like Cuba and Nicaragua. So those experiences definitely sort of informed the choices and the kind of things I write about in my novels.
Now, did your parents or your father tell you a certain way to behave in those environments? What to say, what not to say, things like that?
Yes. I grew up around all kinds of rules and strictures, both that were sort of imposed by the host governments of the countries we lived in, and also by our own government. You had to sort of watch your step everywhere. So it wasn't just my father telling me what to do or not do, but the U.S. government had certain ways that it wanted us to behave. And also, there was a lot of surveillance of foreign diplomats by Soviet authorities, for instance, in
Mhm.
Moscow. Our phones were bugged. There were bugs in the embassy and most likely in our apartments in one way or another.
Wow,
So we lived in sort of this very guarded environment and we had freedom to move around the city. But yeah, this kind of constant sort of suspicion, paranoia, watching your step was something you sort of got used to.
that's a lot of pressure to put on a child, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And so I think having the community of the embassy around you sort of normalizes it, gives you kind of a community to live in full of other Americans faced with the same kinds of situations. So that's what made it kind of our sanctuary for us.
Right. And I'm assuming some memories of that childhood eventually came into play when you began writing about the Cold War.
Yes, exactly. And so the protagonist, the narrator of my first book, is a 14-year-old son of American diplomats like me. So I think about him as someone who I might have, not exactly me, but someone who might have, had the same experiences, maybe as someone I might have met, that kind of thing. And yeah, but I have a lot of vivid but kind of vague memories of that period of my time growing up. So a lot of that sort of powerful visual and memories that I have went into the story too. But also very some of the concrete experiences that I remember. I have my character go to a lot of the same places that I knew and still remember and deal with a lot of the same kind of uncertainties that I faced.
So all this political intrigue that surround you as a child, did that influence your decision to become a journalist and later a PhD in government?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think when I was in college, I was a little bit all over the place about what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to write in some way or another. That was, like I said, that was always a part of my identity. But I figured, well, hey, my dad works for the US government. I must know something about government. So I majored in government, and that led to it was sort of a natural connection to write for newspapers, when you want to write and you have an interest in politics.
Right.
So absolutely informed that kind of choice, and then doing the PhD in political science as well.
So then you transitioned from a journalist to more of an academic writer. Who did you write for?
So, well, I wrote in articles for journals, for political science journals, a couple, and then I turned my dissertation into a book. It was about race relations in American cities in the 80s and 90s, sort of surrounding the Los Angeles riots of 1992. And that was urban politics was my specialty as in my PhD. So yeah, that was published by an academic press, and which is very different from traditional publishing in a lot of ways, a lot easier in some ways. But
Right.
that was sort of
Right.
that was the last piece that I wrote as an academic was my book.
Well, there's no peer review in traditional publishing, except I guess you can
Right.
count beta readers, but
That's right.
different kind of peer review. So, what was that kind of switch that turned inside your brain when that you wanted to made you want to go from nonfiction to fiction?
Well, I think that I had always had this dream that someday I actually remember working as a journalist, and one day my boss asked me what I wanted to do, like long term, what I pictured achieving, decades down the line. And I remember telling him I want to write international thriller novels at some point. I want to be a journalist and then a thriller novel. So I don't know if that was ever present, but it was maybe a seed that was always there. And I left academics for a variety of reasons, but the main one being family related. And it was a tough market when I was in it. And my wife had just sort of started her and was growing her medical practice as a pediatrician in the area. So we decided to sort of stay put, and I exhausted a number of the college lecturer jobs that I had in the area. So it was also a personal decision too. And then I was with my kids, and then I was working with her and on the solo practice that we formed together. And it just kind of just clicked, and I realized that, hey, this is the thing I haven't done yet, and I want to really, give it a try.
And so, a thriller, it sounds like that was a natural progression for you based on your childhood and what you wrote about as an adult.
Yeah, yeah, it doesn't it? It's one of those things you look back and you never really, sometimes you don't imagine that your life has had this direction, but looking back, it does sort of seem like that sometimes. I think that the things that I put into these two novels that I've written, and there's a third I'm working on now, the third book in the series, I sort of pour everything into them that I love or that I'm concerned about. There's sort of they're repositories for sort of who I am as a person and as a writer, my love of music, my interest in history, the kinds of books that I like to read. All of those things went into this novel. I think once you discover that writing a novel reflects a lot of things about you that maybe you weren't even aware of, you sort of you become conscious and aware of that, and you start to act on it, and you act self-consciously and do it even more.
And,
Yeah.
one theme that's really interesting to me is music. And, I remember those times. And, it wasn't only Reagan, that and Gorbachev that brought down the former Soviet Union. It was the Beatles and Western music that gave people in the Eastern Bloc a hint at what Western life was like.
Yes, yes, and that's exactly what my books plug into. A lot of people don't or aren't aware of how much the Cold War had this cultural dimension too, and not even just ideological, but it was also these warring cultures trying to achieve cultural dominance in addition to geopolitical and military and economic dominance. So music was definitely a part of it, and both governments tried to exploit that too. The KGB and the CIA actually made all kinds of endeavors to use artists, their own, American or Soviet artists, to further their interests in the Cold War. And yeah, there was this music has this power to inspire people. Also, on the flip side, has to inspire people to sort of feed the human spirit, to fight repression, and it found its way into behind the Iron Curtain and was really this thing that grew beneath sort of the watch of the authorities in communist countries. And this is something that I wasn't really aware of when I was growing up. That's something I discovered later and found was a real sort of became the backbone of both of my novels. Yeah.
Your novels are named after Beatles songs. How do you, or did you have to navigate any copyright issues? So you don't, specifically quote the lyrics in the book, do you? Or did you get permission?
No, no, I didn't. And so I actually did a lot of, I was very concerned about that. And so I did research. I actually talked to a lawyer in sort of general terms about for advice about that. And what I came to understand is that song titles are not copyrighted or not sort
Hmm.
of subject to copyright. They can be trademarked in sort of very rare occasional circumstances, but most times they aren't. But yeah, the sort of more fraught territory is quoting song lyrics, and I did not do that at all in the book. I occasionally sort of paraphrased or misquoted song lyrics and made that into sort of a plot point. But I didn't want to do that, and I tried to sort of navigate that and still make it very much about the music, if not about the words themselves, how the
Yeah.
music made people feel and what it inspired them to
Well, if this reaches the attention of Paul McCartney or whoever owns the
do.
rights to the Beatles songs now, that's a feather in your cap anyway, even if it's
That would be
followed by a
wonderful.
cease and desist order. But it sounds like you're on solid ground. You've said that setting is also crucial in your book. So how do you recreate the historical cities like Prague and Moscow?
So, yeah, so that's a good question. So, for Moscow, like I said, I had a lot of these very vivid memories, and I knew a lot about the city itself, but I also supplemented that with other kinds of research, like all kinds of different sources. And I did the same both for Moscow and for Prague. I read not only nonfiction, but also I read novels set in both places, written by people who actually had spent time there. I studied maps, I read firsthand accounts, I watched movies, all kinds of just different sort of multimedia sources to really get a feel for places. And as my characters move about the city, I have them actually, I sort of follow and trace their movements on maps so that they're sort of realistic in terms of the time they take to get to places, the how sort of what the challenges are in each particular place, both physical and otherwise. So yeah, I really tried to get a feel for what it was like to be in these places so that my readers could be running right alongside my characters.
Right.
Very important to me.
Right. One thing, and I can't help it, maybe because I'm an editor, is when I read time-based, period-based thrillers or any kind of book, I look for anachronisms. Obviously, you're not going to have somebody talking on their cell phones in 1968, but things like, the vernacular or slang of the time. Is this something that you're especially careful about?
So yeah, so I don't think well, obviously anachronisms is something I was very concerned about. As you know, someone who did a PhD and is very concerned about those, accuracy, historical accuracy and things like that. But in terms of language, I don't think I really was very concerned about making my characters talk like people in those times necessarily. I mean, I think what I would do is I would have them use certain phrases occasionally, but it wasn't something I wanted my readers to be able to sort of connect to the voice. And I think I'm sort of a I'm an efficient writer, so I use like maybe hints rather than
Right.
over explain. At least I try to.
Right. But not too
Yeah.
much of, groovy and stuff like that, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's very occasional. And
Yeah.
I also I sprinkle foreign non-English words into the text also, but I don't overdo them. It's sort of like giving sometimes you don't need a lot of detail to create a scene, whether or to create dialogue to sort of fill it out. You just need one or two really well chosen details. And that was my approach. And also what I learned from some of the editors I worked with gave me very good advice about that.
So you finally decided to go the indie route after I think you tried the traditional paths. How's that going? What's been the most rewarding and most challenging part of being indie?
Oh, wow. Well, like I said, I love a good project. And I do have this sort of entrepreneurial spirit, which I discovered running a business. But it's the whole thing is everything about it is challenging, Howard. And I think that the there's just so much experimentation involved because there is so much like really great advice out there. And one of the things that Ally was really helpful. One of the first things that I did when I decided to self-publish was join Ally, and I never regretted it. It's paid off in so many ways, and I'm still discovering new ways. But
Wonderful.
is you really have
And
to
I
try a
didn't
lot
tell
of
you to say
things.
that, by the way. So that's
That was
a
voluntary.
natural
Oh,
endorsement. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
that's right. Yeah, is that there's you just have to experiment with so many things and a lot of things will not work. And I've tried so many things that have worked just a little bit. And I think fortunately I'm someone who I'm create a creative puzzle solver, or I like to solve puzzles. I don't always solve them, but I like to try. And it's really helpful, I think, because I'm constantly coming up with new things that I want to try or reading about new things I want to try. And I think what I'm engaged in right now is actually one of the most rewarding so far. And that is I'm trying to connect to teenagers in middle schools and high schools in my area to begin with, at least, and going to schools and library groups and to speak to kids about writing and storytelling. And so I've just very recently I've given a talk to an eighth grade assembly and joined a young writers group at a public library. And it's great just talking to these kids about books and about writing and helping them to sort of see that they've got a story inside them and using their sort of own perspectives and experiences, they can bring that out. And it's become a mission for me, I think, even apart from my writing, but it's connected because of course, I want them to know about my books too and
Right.
potentially get interested in them.
Are they interested in the Cold War era? I guess the comparison would be when we were kids. There were kids our age into World War II.
Well,
Time
it's
difference
funny
isn't the
because
same.
yeah, some of them are, and some of them maybe aren't as much. But one group of kids I was talking to recently, we were talking about dystopian fiction, which is still really big among younger teens, and like The Hunger Games, those books are still big, believe it or not. And so I talked about how a lot of the themes in dystopian fiction come straight out of the Cold War, and trying to make that kind of connection. You put it in those terms, and I think a lot of them get it because dystopian worlds are all about surveillance and repression and authoritarian governments, and they may be set in sort of a near future, but they're rooted in the past in sort of experiences that we've already had. So yeah, it's something to sort of help them make connections, I think.
Yeah.
But
So young people are reading. I have two college age sons, and one of them is telling me that young people are actually unplugging from devices and reading physical books now. So that gives me some hope.
yeah, ditto. It's heartening to hear things like that. And I witness it. I know it's happening. Even if numbers seem to be going the other direction, there's a lot of people in the world, right? So even if fewer kids are reading than used to, there's still a lot of those kids who are reading, and hopefully it'll catch fire and ignite, spark interest in their friends and peers also.
So what about you? So you're working on a third book in your Cold War trilogy. Are you working on anything else?
So, wow, I think that's enough, Howard. But of
More,
course,
more. We want more.
like a lot of writers, I always have future projects in mind. So I want to go back to the historical, sort of older historical mystery set in the 17th century England that I spent 10 years trying to write before I wrote these books. I want to go back to that and work on that. I also I have like other ideas that for both this series that I'm working on and for other projects. Unfortunately, I'm able to concentrate mostly on one book at a time, but it's sort of hard to keep a writer down when it comes to
I understand. Yeah.
if hunting after and following and chasing ideas.
Yeah. Now, what about marketing? This is a question I ask all indie authors because that's the most challenging part, getting people to notice you. What are you doing in terms of advertising or marketing or social media or any of the above?
Yeah, so like a bunch of those things, and my campaigns to connect with local schools is my big project right now, the one that I've sort of embarked on, and so that's the newest part, and I'm sort of going local. But yeah, I've tried my hand at a little bit of at advertising, and my social media efforts are ongoing. When I published my first book, I was able to get the manuscript out to lots of not beta readers, but sort of ARC readers locally, and that was really, really helpful to sort of get those reviews on Amazon when the book first came out. So yeah, I almost feel like what haven't I tried? And there are certain things that I've, sort of let go by the wayside when they weren't either they felt too much like work and I wasn't enjoying them enough, or if they just didn't seem to be paying off. But I'm still at the point, Howard, where I'm still sort of working for every sale. And I realized that I'm only 2 years into this now. Back in the USSR, my first book came out 2 years ago. And so 2 years is really not that much time. And so I'm still sort of working for every sale at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
And
I like the local
yeah,
focus. I've been hearing that a lot
yeah,
about with other writers. That's really important. Not just the school visits, which I think are a great idea, but you can probably get some local media attention.
yeah.
Well,
Yeah, exactly, exactly. One of the things I wish I had done differently was to start with that. And you really don't know what you're doing, even though no matter how much research you do, when you begin this process, there's always a learning curve and it's got to keep trying new things. And yeah,
now you're in Massachusetts. So what town in Massachusetts?
I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Well, I guess my last question is, what advice do you have for other writers, especially those who have juggled other careers in their lives and want to get back in or want to get into writing fiction?
Yeah, so I think that for me, for a long time when I was first started, trying my hand at writing a novel, one thing I didn't understand was that it's not just about putting the words on the page, sitting down and typing or handwriting your book. And it's about really giving your mind, your brain space to think about it. And one of the sort of patterns that I've really adopted for myself is doing things that get my brain to sort of get my subconscious to sort of kick into action and start doing a lot of the work on its own so that so that I'm sort of giving my brain tasks and it's
Hmm.
working on them. And then ideas will sort of come to me whenever they do. And then I just have to be ready to capture them, have my notebook handy or pull out my phone and start, typing into it furiously to capture an idea so that I can sort of capture ideas and have them ready for me when I do actually find the time to write. And when I was actually busier in my professional life and it was really hard to find time to write, that would have been really helpful for me to know, I think, that you sort of have to find ways to sort of live and breathe your story apart from just the actual writing process.
Yeah.
And the words will follow more easily if you can find that kind of
Yeah,
a
yeah.
series of.
That's great advice, especially if you're juggling a career, family. It's
Yeah,
hard to,
yeah,
at the end of the day or beginning of the day, just sit down and say, okay, now be creative now. And
exactly.
uh,
Yes, yes, yes. Because
so,
there's extra pressure when you do that.
yeah.
I had a lot of trouble with that. And so I think one thing I did coming off of being a researcher, a political scientist with a PhD, was that the one thing I knew how to do was to research. And so that was my initial crutch for when I first started writing a novel, the one that I haven't published yet that I hope to go back to, is that was my way of generating ideas. And that's okay. And that works for certain kinds of novels. But for my young adult mystery thrillers, I think what really enabled me to really get them out was finding how to give myself space to think and not just to force myself to sit down and write.
I have a novel coming out next week, and I wrote it primarily in my
Oh,
head
wow.
while I was running, because
Perfect.
that's exactly when the endorphins are doing their job and your brain starts to make these connections. The trick is Then after you cool off, after you run, to sit down and remember these inspirations you had while you're exercising. But that's what works for me.
Yeah, well, first of all, congratulations. That's really exciting.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, wow. So, yeah, I think writers have to find their own way of getting their creative juices flowing and yeah, and then their own ways of sort of capturing the ideas.
Right.
But it's probably going to be different for different people.
Well, thank you, Patrick. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. We covered the Cold War, we covered music, we've covered how to get inspiration. Is there anything else that you want to add that I didn't ask?
No, I think that covers enough. But
Okay,
yeah, I really appreciate you having me on the podcast. It's, I'm a listener already, and so it's just amazing to actually to be on the show and thank you for having me.
wonderful. Thank you, Patrick.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Inspirational Indie Authors. I'm Howard Lovey, Content and Communications Manager at the Alliance of Independent Authors and book editor at howardlovey.com. This podcast stream is proudly sponsored by BookVault. Sell high-quality print-on-demand books directly to readers worldwide and earn maximum royalties selling directly. Automate fulfillment and create stunning special editions with BookVault Bespoke. Visit bookvault.app today for an instant quote. If you are a member of Ally and would like to be considered for the show, please write to me at howard@allianceindependentauthors.org and tell me what inspires you and how you can inspire other authors. As always, find more author advice, tips, and tools at our Self-Publishing Advice Center, selfpublishingadvice.org. And if you haven't already, we invite you to join our organization and become a self-publishing ally. You can do that at allianceindependentauthors.org.